So we're in the middle of this Love You See series. This is a multi-church movement, 18 area churches coming together, reading the same book, The Art of Neighboring, and thinking about how we're going to be better neighbors, love that is visible in our community. And if we take a step back and take stock of what we've covered so far, we'll remember that the neighbors you have are no accident, but part of God's intention for your life, and maybe / hopefully for their lives too. And of course, that neighboring is no easy task. It takes aligning our intentions with God's intention, which likely means we need to be honest and serious about the barriers that face us and challenge us from being good neighbors. Barriers like time and fear will continue to challenge our ability to live into God's will. But the challenge is drastically reduced when we can name the specific barriers and work/pray against them, all while trusting that God is in the barrier-busting business. This week, then, brings us to what happens after we've begun to know our neighbors better and better, and the results should be a growing sense of friendship. Jay Pathak and Dave Runyon understand this process really well in their book, The Art of Neighboring. They even break relationship building into stages. Now, these stages are meant more to help us understand growth and shouldn't really be treated like a to-do list, something to check off. So overall, the intent is quite helpful. And they note that the typical relationship moves this way: stranger to acquaintance, acquaintance to relationship. While the authors do in the book, if you have been reading along, critique our media portrayals. Bruce, are you guys getting feedback like really tinny? No, that's just me getting it? Oh, okay. Good, well, I'll play through. Awesome, as long as you all are happy, awesome. All right, so the authors do in the book, if you've been playing along, critique some of our media portrayals of relationships. They say that relationships are often full of these big actions, significant moments of monumental consequence. But I think their criticism is a bit of a reach. I think that because our movies, especially our rom-coms, are full of meet cutes. Does everybody know what a meet cute is? It's that seemingly innocent moment where boy bumps into girl and spark is seen and is recorded for us, and we know, the audience is like, oh, they're gonna get together, you know? Now, we see this most frequently in a romantic context, but there have been increasingly some fun examples of meet cutes for friendships. 22 Jump Street, for instance, really lays it on thick when they have a Q-tip fall into somebody's sandwich of another guy, and they're like, oh, it's a meet cute. Yeah, like I said, it's a bit of a stretch, but my favorite comes from the Judd Apatow directed Ode to Male Friendship, I Love You Man. Peter, who's played by Paul Rudd, a rom-com staple, but also Ant-Man, is a real estate agent trying to sell Lou Ferrigno's mansion. And while he's there, he meets Sydney. He's played by Jason Segel, an investor who is attending the show simply to pick up divorced women and because he likes free food. The two quickly become friends, especially when they realize they share a mutual adoration of the progressive rock band Rush. And boom, just like that, they are friends. All it takes is Peter being open to making new friends and Sydney open to, well, as Sydney's character is, anything. The rest of the film is indeed a tribute to how friendship is formed, tested, and matured. The Art of Neighboring asks us to put ourselves in a position to experience these sorts of happenings in our own lives. These chapters, 5 and 6 this week, move us from theory and into practice. shows us how the life as Jesus is more than just a theory on loving one's neighbor. It is the practice of it. And one of the keenest examples of this comes from the passage that we read in Luke today, where Jesus encounters Levi, the tax collector, and is immediately invited to a party that Levi is throwing. Now, as the authors make clear, this wasn't a polite Sunday potluck, but the sort of party where people were showing up to have fun. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Well, this probably isn't the sort of party that Jesus would have thrown if he were in charge. He knew that building relationships is a holy activity even when it takes place in less than holy environments. So he shows up, is fed and hosted by this sinner, and when later challenged on his actions, reminds the religious leaders that it isn't the healthy that need a doctor. Jesus was there to heal the broken places in the life of Levi and his friends. But to do this, even Jesus, the creator and redeemer of the entire cosmos, even Jesus had to take baby steps necessary into growing a relationship. Our Old Testament reading shows us this is nothing new. Once you get past all those strange, the liturgist who has to read this passage really earns their keep this week names. And by the way, I only did that to pick on Paul. If you're a liturgist, I would never give you a passage like that. Exclusively reserved as Paul harassment, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Once you get past what he worked through so admirably, by the way, you see that it's really a story about how David and his supporters are on the run from the treasonous intentions of David's son, Absalom. And while on the run, another group of supporters shows up and takes care of David in every way. Just look at the list of the things that the supporters bring with them. Beds, basins, and earthen vessels. That's so that people could rest and bathe and restore themselves. Wheat, barley, meal, parched grain, beans, and lentils, so that they could be fed the basic necessities to keep going. Honey and curd, sheep and cheese from the herds, so that they could be more than fed, but actually treated. And why did these supporters do all this? The text just says, the troops are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. That is, they wanted to show them that they cared for them in a way that is visible and obvious. This was love, you see. This was love, you see. The opportunity before us then is to start taking the baby steps necessary to building these neighborly relationships. At the very least, this involves getting out and getting to know the names of your neighbors. This is the process of moving from stranger to acquaintance. And the authors recommend, and I would really love it if all of you became this sort of influence in your neighborhoods, they recommend getting out and learning everyone's names. And if you can manage that, then the next step, the next goal is to create a neighborhood directory. You know how tough communications is in the church, right? I mean, we hired a communications specialist just for this reason. It's hard to make sure that folks know what is happening where, when, and with whom. Leaving alone the irony that we live in the so-called information age, getting info around and seen is really actually quite difficult. Well, if that's true for a church, for a group of people who are committed to coming together in fellowship, then you can imagine how hard it would be for a street full of relative strangers. And so the challenge is, why not become the communication specialist of your neighborhood? Why not invite people to share their name, address, phone, and email, or any of that they feel comfortable with, and then pass this out to one another so that you have the ability to connect with one another? It's a riveting first step to building relationships, to seeing relationships as something worth intentional action and not just left to chance, to the vicissitudes of fate, to the meet cute. So what happens after you connect? What happens when strangers are now acquaintances? That answer is a little more nebulous. How relationships flower and bloom is not easily defined, but it will undoubtedly find its root in one thing: mutual service. And do hear that. It is mutual service. The biggest mistake that we can make in growing our relationships with our neighbors is to assume a one-sided posture in which we are the benevolent, Christ-filled neighbor lovers, and everyone else had better take our spoonful of sugar or else. This mutuality of service is the surprising twist in both of our readings this morning. In both of them, it is the King, David and Jesus, who does not do the serving, but is served. We're so used to kings being big, powerful people who can command and create and do, but in both of these stories, they are forced to sit back and receive the service of others. And so, this is where I want you to go ahead and pull your neighboring card out, because we've got another exercise this week. So we've begun a couple weeks ago by trying to list the name and then some basic information about each neighbor, and then on line C, we tried to list something that you could only know about a person because you truly know them. A hope, a dream, maybe a fear or a deep sorrow. Not the sort of thing that comes out when you're like, well, the crabgrass is really bad this year, but like you have a real relationship. And last week, we asked you to use the same thing, noting the same 8 neighbors, but to talk about the barriers between you and your neighbors, physical or relational, real or imaginary. So this week I'm going to ask you to do 2 things. One, and let's say line A, write down ways that you think you can serve your neighbors. Now, the more you know about them, the more specific you can be. Like if you're like, I'll babysit their kids, but they don't have kids, that's not a great service. It's easy babysitting, but it's not a great service. So try your best, or at the very least, just list a skill you know you have that you love to share with others. But then in line C, I want you to list how you might need to be served by them. Things that are lacking in your life. Skills you don't have that you think or know your neighbors might have. I am particularly thrilled that Brianna and I just got new neighbors, Russ and Chandra, because Russ clearly knows how to fix things, and I clearly know how to hold the flashlight. That's all my dad taught me to do, was hold the flashlight. So think about that. So go ahead, take a minute. Line A, ways that you want to serve, but line C, ways that you're going to open yourself up and be vulnerable to receiving the service of others. right. I'm sure you're not done yet, but that's a good homework assignment to take out of here and to continue to think about. I suspect that line A was easier to fill out. Who thought line A was pretty easy to fill out? Because line A is about your ego, right? Line A is like, here's a thing that I'm awesome at, and I'm going to make sure everybody knows it. Line C, though, that's the hard one. And it seems a little weird, maybe, to come to church to hear a lesson about how to be, how to use your neighbors for your own self-interest. But that is, again, what we see in both of our readings this morning. We see Jesus and David allowing themselves to be served, and transformative relationships bloomed in the space of their humility. And this is necessary because while relationships are as a nebulous next step, we can say that relationships is just the word we use to describe acts of mutual caring. There is no way to have a relationship with your neighbor that doesn't involve you accepting their love too. I want to conclude with a providential story that I think summarizes well all that we've discussed these first 3 weeks. On the Sunday after I preached the first of these Art of Neighboring sermons, April 28th, 2 weeks ago, Donna Maley and I headed over to the Gables to do communion. Now, Bill Hecker wasn't up for joining the small group that we assembled, and so after we had communion with them, Donna and I went to his room for a short visit. Now, every time I see Bill, he tells me the same story. And those of you who know Bill Hecker know that he played minor league baseball, was, on the tracks to the majors. He's got some pretty cool stories, right? But none of the stories he tells me is about his athletic prowess. Though if I had half an ounce of athletic prowess, that is all I would talk to you all about. No, it's always the same story, and it is the story of Bill and Jack Grote. I hope to do the story justice, but it goes something like this. Bill moved to Marysville to run a shoe store for his uncle. Somewhere along the line, he discovered that he really loved running a shoe store, at least here in Marysville. And so he bought the business off of his uncle and purchased a home in a neighborhood here in Marysville. Shortly after he bought his first home, he was walking his dog down the street. All of the sudden, a friendly, gruff voice barked, "What sort of dog is that?" Enter Jack Grote. Bill and Jack got to talking, and Jack asked him what church he went to. Bill tells me that he studied the ground very intently as he shared that he wasn't going to church at the moment. And so Jack said, "Well, that's fine. You're coming to my church now." There's two things I want to take away from this story. One, Jack is the very definition of bold. And two, evangelism was a lot easier in the 60s. It really was. You're coming with me. Come on. The churches just went around town just claiming dibbies on people. How fun is that? Bill goes on to tell how he and his family flourished at First Presbyterian Church. Bill would become president of the congregation for scores of years, and their families would become friends, often even sharing vacations together, Bill and his wife Jack and Joy. Every time I visit Bill, he tells me this story. And I don't think it's because he's slipping. He really does seem really mentally sharp. And I hope it isn't because he thinks I'm a dolt, though the jury's still out on that one. No, I think he repeats it because he's trying to tell me an important story, and important stories need told often. What I love about this story, though, is Jack's character. You see, Bill thinks it's just natural for pastors to walk up to people, to strangers, and introduce themselves. And I suppose that it's part of the job, but I also know for a fact that pastors are human too. And they don't necessarily always love that sort of action. And so I can imagine Jack seeing Bill and his little dog walking down the street and thinking, shoot, they moved here 6 weeks ago. I still haven't gotten over there to introduce myself. I really just want to go to the store, but all right, let's do this. And so he broke the ice. What sort of dog is that? I'm not sure if that qualifies as a meet cute, but I'll take it. Neighboring. It's an intentional act whether you're Jesus, Jack Grote, or just merely yourself. It never feels less than awkward at the outset, but the successes always feel great. And when the act of building a relationship with another really blooms, well, it comes to define a life. That's why Bill Hecker keeps telling me that story. Bill's trying to tell me a part of what defines him. He's Jack Grote's friend. He's Jesus's friend. When we go out and we love our neighbors, when we choose a holy verb with which to verb them, we put in motion potentially life-defining stories. And that seems huge, and that seems intimidating, that can even seem terrifying. But don't let it freak you all out. Instead, just take the first steps, the first baby steps. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen.